Picture this. Two civilizations, each convinced they're destined to rule the Mediterranean. Both have armies that have never truly tasted defeat. Both have populations that believe their gods have chosen them for greatness. Now imagine what happens when these unstoppable forces finally collide. The year is 264 BC. Rome controls most of Italy through a combination of brilliant diplomacy and ruthless military precision. Meanwhile, across the sea, Carthage has built the ancient world's greatest trading empire, with ships that carry precious goods to every corner of the known world. For decades, these two powers have eyed each other warily, but respectfully. But what happened next would shatter that uneasy peace forever. What started as a minor dispute over a single city would explode into a 23-year war of such brutal intensity that it would reshape the ancient world permanently. This is the story of the First Punic Wars, and trust me, what's about to unfold is absolutely incredible. Here's what you need to understand about the world of 264 BC. The Mediterranean isn't just a body of water. It's the entire universe as far as these ancient peoples are concerned. And two civilizations have risen to dominate this world in completely different ways. Let's start with Rome. By 264 BC, Rome has spent over 2 centuries perfecting the art of land warfare. Picture rows upon rows of disciplined soldiers, their bronze shields locked together like an impenetrable wall. These aren't just warriors. They're the most professional military machine the world has ever seen. Every Roman citizen serves in the legions. Every victory adds new territory to their growing republic. But here's what makes Rome truly terrifying. They don't just defeat their enemies, they absorb them. City after city across Italy has learned the same lesson. Resist Rome and face destruction. Submit to Rome and become part of something greater. It's a system that has turned a single Italian city-state into the master of an entire peninsula. Now you might be thinking, okay, Rome sounds pretty impressive, but wait until you hear about their opponents. Carthage isn't just a city. It's a maritime empire that spans 3 continents. Founded by Phoenician traders centuries earlier, Carthage has built its power not through conquest, but through commerce. Their ships carry gold from Spain, ivory from Africa, and grain from Sicily to markets across the Mediterranean. Here's what's absolutely incredible about Carthaginian society. While Romans are training with swords and shields, Carthaginians are mastering navigation, currency, and international trade. They've created the ancient world's first truly global economy. Their merchants speak a dozen languages. Their ships know every current and wind pattern from Gibraltar to the Black Sea. And here's the crucial detail you need to remember. Carthage doesn't rely on citizen soldiers like Rome does. Instead, they hire the best mercenaries money can buy. Numidian cavalry from North Africa who can fire arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. Spanish infantry with weapons forged from the finest steel. Greek engineers who can build siege weapons that can knock down any wall. The stage was set for an absolutely epic confrontation, but no one could have predicted what would trigger it. For decades, Rome and Carthage had maintained what you might call a respectful distance. Rome focused on land-based expansion. Carthage dominated the seas. There was even a treaty between them. Rome would stay out of Carthaginian waters, and Carthage would respect Roman territory in Italy. But treaties, well, they're only as strong as the circumstances that create them. The trouble began in Sicily. This large island sits right at the center of the Mediterranean, perfectly positioned to control trade routes between east and west. The eastern part of Sicily was controlled by Greeks. The western part belonged to Carthage, and right in the middle was the city of Messana. Now, Messana had been taken over by a group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines. These weren't noble warriors fighting for their homeland. They were essentially armed bandits who had seized control of the city and were using it as a base for piracy and raids. Here's where things get interesting. When the Greek city of Syracuse decided to move against these Mamertine pirates, the Mamertines faced a desperate choice. They could surrender and face certain execution, or they could ask for help. But who could they turn to? They sent ambassadors to both Rome and Carthage asking for protection. Can you imagine the discussions that must have taken place in both cities? In Carthage, the decision was relatively straightforward. Sicily was in their sphere of influence. They had every right to intervene. Carthaginian ships quickly sailed to Messana and established a garrison there. But in Rome, the debate was far more intense. You have to understand, Romans prided themselves on fighting honorable wars. Helping a bunch of pirates didn't exactly fit their image as defenders of justice and order. Many senators argued that Rome had no business getting involved in Sicilian affairs, but other voices were louder. Look at the map, they argued. If Carthage controls Messana, they control the strait between Sicily and Italy. Carthaginian ships could threaten our coasts. Carthaginian armies could use Sicily as a stepping stone to invade Italy itself. The Roman Popular Assembly made their decision. They would send help to Messana. Now here's what's absolutely crucial to understand. This wasn't just a political decision. This was Rome's first major step beyond the Italian peninsula. For the first time in their history, Roman legions would fight overseas. For the first time, Rome would challenge Carthage's naval supremacy. Neither side realized it yet, but they had just lit the fuse on a conflict that would consume the Mediterranean world for over 2 decades. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because what's about to unfold is even more incredible than anyone could have imagined. The Roman consul Appius Claudius Caudex stood on the shore of the Italian mainland, staring across the narrow strait at Sicily. Just 3 miles of water separated him from what would become one of Rome's greatest challenges. Trouble was brewing, and everyone knew it. The Carthaginians had beaten the Romans to Messana and established their garrison. But Rome had made their decision. They were coming, whether Carthage liked it or not. Here's where Appius Claudius showed the kind of boldness that would define Roman character for centuries. He loaded his legions onto whatever ships he could find and sailed directly for Messana. When the Carthaginian commander saw Roman ships approaching, he must have thought, "These Romans have lost their minds." You can imagine how the Carthaginian garrison commander felt when Roman legions started disembarking on the beaches of Sicily. This was supposed to be Carthaginian territory. These Romans had no business here. But here's what the Carthaginians didn't fully understand about Roman psychology. Once Romans made a commitment, they saw it through to the end, no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost. The first confrontation was almost anticlimactic. The Carthaginian and Roman armies faced each other outside Messana, and then the Carthaginians withdrew. Not because they were cowards, but because they recognized something important. This wasn't going to be a quick skirmish. This was going to be a real war. Both sides began mobilizing their full strength. From Rome came legion after legion of disciplined infantry. These soldiers had conquered Italy through a combination of tactical flexibility and sheer determination. They were used to facing different types of enemies, from wild Gallic warriors to sophisticated Greek phalanxes, but they had never fought a truly maritime power before. From Carthage came the finest mercenary army money could buy. Imagine the scene. Ships arriving from across the Mediterranean, bringing warriors from a dozen different cultures. Light cavalry from Numidia, their horses bred for speed and endurance. Heavy infantry from Libya, armed with the latest Greek weapons and tactics. Engineers from Spain who could build siege equipment that could crack open any fortress. And that's when everyone started to realize this wasn't going to be a typical ancient war. Most ancient conflicts were decided by a single major battle. Army meets army, one side wins. The loser surrenders or gets wiped out. Game over. But Sicily wasn't going to be that simple. The island was dotted with fortified cities, each one potentially requiring a lengthy siege. The terrain varied from coastal plains to mountainous highlands, requiring different tactical approaches. Most importantly, Carthage controlled the sea routes around Sicily. They could reinforce their positions, supply their armies, and even evacuate troops if necessary. Rome, with virtually no navy, would have to fight this war with one hand tied behind their back. The early campaigns were a series of brutal learning experiences for both sides. Roman legions proved they could take fortified positions through sheer persistence. They would surround a Carthaginian stronghold, build siege works, and simply wait. Romans were incredibly good at waiting. Their discipline and organization meant they could maintain a siege indefinitely while their enemies inside the walls slowly starved. But every Roman success created a new problem. How do you hold territory when your enemy controls the sea? Carthaginian fleets could land fresh troops anywhere along Sicily's coast. They could supply besieged cities. They could attack Roman supply lines. Here's what's fascinating about this early phase of the war. Both sides were fighting outside their comfort zones. Romans were used to quick, decisive campaigns on land. Now they were stuck in a grinding war of attrition on an island they could barely supply. Carthaginians were used to using their naval superiority to avoid major land battles. Now they were being forced to defend fixed positions against the most persistent army in the ancient world. The stalemate stretched on for years. Rome would capture a city. Carthage would send a fleet to retake it. Carthage would establish a new base. Rome would march an army to besiege it. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow. But here's where Roman character started to show through. Instead of accepting the limitations of fighting a naval power, Romans decided to do something unprecedented. Something that seemed absolutely crazy to anyone who understood ancient warfare. Rome decided to build a navy. Now you might think, well, that makes sense. But you have to understand, Romans had virtually no experience with naval warfare. They were land-based people. Their entire military tradition was built around disciplined infantry fighting in formation. Naval combat was a completely different skill set requiring different tactics, different training, different everything. Most ancient peoples would have said, we can't compete with Carthage at sea. Let's find another way. But Romans looked at the situation and said, we can't compete with Carthage at sea. Yet, what happened next will absolutely blow your mind. Roman engineers somehow got their hands on a wrecked Carthaginian warship that had been beached on the Italian coast. They took it apart piece by piece, studying every detail of its construction. Then they used it as a template to build an entire fleet. Can you believe it? Romans learned naval architecture by reverse engineering a single enemy ship. But here's the most incredible part. Romans knew they couldn't match Carthaginian seamanship overnight. So they did what Romans always did when facing a superior enemy. They changed the rules of the game. Roman engineers invented a device called the corvus, essentially a boarding bridge with a giant spike on the end. When a Roman ship got close to an enemy vessel, they would drop this bridge onto the enemy deck. The spike would anchor the two ships together and Roman marines would charge across. Think about the genius of this innovation. Romans turned naval combat into land combat. Instead of trying to ram enemy ships or maneuver for favorable positions, they could simply grab onto enemy vessels and fight the kind of close-quarters battle they were experts at. The first major test of this new Roman navy came at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC. Roman consul Gaius Duilius commanded a fleet of over 100 ships against a Carthaginian navy that had never lost a major sea battle. The Carthaginians must have been confident as they approached. After all, they were facing Romans at sea. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. When the Carthaginian ships closed in for what they expected to be a routine ramming attack, the Romans dropped their corvée. Suddenly, highly trained Roman marines were pouring onto Carthaginian decks. Ship after ship was captured in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. The result? Rome's first major naval victory. 50 Carthaginian ships were captured or sunk. But the real impact of Mylae went far beyond the tactical victory. For the first time, Romans had proven they could challenge Carthaginian naval supremacy. The war that had been stalemate was about to become something much more dangerous. Little did anyone know. This was only the beginning of a conflict that would push both civilizations to their absolute limits. The moment of truth had arrived. With their stunning victory at Mylae, Romans had shattered the myth of Carthaginian naval invincibility. But winning one sea battle and controlling the Mediterranean were two entirely different things. Here's what you need to understand about the strategic situation after Mylae. Rome now had the capability to transport large armies anywhere in the Mediterranean. But capability and opportunity are different things. Where should they strike to achieve maximum impact? Roman strategic thinking was typically direct. Attack the enemy's strongest point and defeat them there. If Romans could capture Carthage itself, the war would be over. But getting to Carthage meant crossing the Mediterranean and fighting Carthage on their home territory in North Africa. The man chosen to lead this audacious invasion was Marcus Atilius Regulus, one of Rome's most experienced generals. Regulus had spent years fighting in Sicily and understood better than anyone how Carthaginian military power actually worked. Picture the scene as Regulus prepared his invasion fleet. Over 300 Roman ships loaded with 40,000 legionaries, the largest expeditionary force Rome had ever assembled. These weren't just soldiers. They were Rome's finest veterans, men who had learned to fight Carthaginian tactics through years of brutal experience in Sicily. The Carthaginian response was immediate and massive. They assembled a fleet of over 300 ships of their own, determined to destroy the Roman invasion force before it could reach Africa. The two fleets met off Cape Ecnomus on the southern coast of Sicily, in what would become the largest naval battle in ancient history. Nearly 700 ships carrying over 300,000 men were about to collide in a fight for control of the Mediterranean. You can imagine the tension as these massive fleets approached each other. Roman ships bristling with their deadly corvi, ready to turn the sea battle into the kind of close-quarters fighting they excelled at. Carthaginian vessels relying on superior seamanship and ramming tactics that had dominated Mediterranean warfare for centuries. The battle was absolutely chaotic. Ships rammed into each other, breaking apart in explosions of wood and bronze. Roman corvi crashed down onto Carthaginian decks, and marines fought desperately in the swaying, blood-soaked spaces between vessels. The sea itself turned red with blood as thousands of men fought and died in one of the most brutal naval engagements in human history. When the carnage finally ended, Rome had won another crushing victory. Over 100 Carthaginian ships had been captured or destroyed. The path to Africa lay open. Regulus landed his army on the beaches near Carthage and began one of the most ambitious campaigns in Roman history. His initial success was remarkable. Roman legions defeated Carthaginian forces in several battles and advanced to within striking distance of Carthage itself. Here's where things get absolutely incredible. For a brief moment, it looked like Rome might actually win the entire war in a single campaign. Carthaginian resistance was crumbling. Several African cities switched sides and joined the Romans. Carthage itself began negotiating for peace, but Regulus made a decision that would change everything. The Carthaginian peace terms were generous. They would evacuate Sicily, pay reparations, and essentially accept Roman domination of the Western Mediterranean. Any reasonable general would have accepted these terms and returned to Rome as the conqueror of Carthage. Regulus demanded more. He wanted Carthage to give up all their overseas territories. He wanted massive tribute payments that would essentially bankrupt the city. He wanted terms so harsh that Carthage would never again be able to challenge Rome. You're probably thinking, well, that sounds reasonable from a Roman perspective. But here's what Regulus didn't fully understand about Carthaginian psychology. Carthaginians were traitors, but they were also incredibly proud. They had built their civilization through centuries of struggle against hostile neighbors, pirate raids, and natural disasters. Being humiliated might be worse than destruction. The Carthaginian Senate rejected Regulus's terms, and that's when everything started to fall apart for Rome. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and Carthage found theirs in the form of a Spartan general named Xanthippus. This wasn't just any mercenary. Xanthippus was trained in the latest Greek military science and had extensive experience fighting against Roman-style armies. When Xanthippus arrived in Carthage and studied the strategic situation, he immediately identified the Roman weakness. Regulus had advanced too far from his coastal bases. His supply lines were stretched thin. Most importantly, he was fighting in terrain that favored Carthaginian cavalry and war elephants over Roman infantry. What happened next was a masterclass in tactical adaptation. Xanthippus rebuilt the Carthaginian army using a completely new approach. Instead of relying on traditional Carthaginian tactics, he created a combined arms force specifically designed to counter Roman strengths. Heavy infantry to match Roman legions shield for shield, light cavalry to harass Roman flanks and supply lines, and most terrifyingly, over 100 war elephants. Now you might be thinking, war elephants? Really? But these weren't just for show. Ancient war elephants were essentially living tanks. Each one carried a crew of archers or spear throwers. Their charge could break infantry formations that had never faced anything like them. Most importantly, Roman horses had never seen elephants before and would panic at their scent. The confrontation came in 255 BC on the plains outside Carthage. Regulus commanded about 15,000 veterans, men who had conquered Sicily and defeated every Carthaginian force they had faced. They were confident, experienced, and absolutely certain of victory. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The battle began with the elephant charge. Imagine the scene. Over 100 of these massive creatures thundering across the plain, their trumpeting audible for miles, their armored crews raining arrows and javelins down on the Roman ranks. Roman horses panicked immediately. The carefully organized Roman battle line began to waver as gaps opened up where cavalry should have provided support. That's when Xanthippus launched his coordinated assault. Heavy infantry hitting the Roman center while Numidian cavalry swept around the flanks. The result was catastrophic for Rome. Regulus's army wasn't just defeated, it was annihilated. Only 2,000 Romans managed to escape back to their ships. The rest were killed or captured, including Regulus himself. But the real disaster was strategic. In one day, Rome had lost not just an army, but their entire position in Africa. Worse, they had lost the psychological advantage they had built up through years of victories. Now here's what's crucial to understand about this moment. Any other ancient state would probably have sued for peace after such a devastating defeat. Losing an entire army and a commanding general was typically the end of a war. But Romans don't think like other people. When news of the disaster reached Rome, the Senate's response was immediate and characteristic. Build another army, build another fleet, continue the war. The disaster in Africa had taught Rome something important about fighting Carthage. This wasn't going to be won through a single decisive campaign. This was going to be a test of endurance, resources, and sheer willpower. And that kind of test, that was exactly the kind of war Rome was built to win. But the real test was yet to come. Things were about to get much, much worse for both sides. You know what? If you're as fascinated by this incredible story as I am, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps us bring more of these untold stories of empires, battles, and human drama to life. Trust me, the best part is still coming. Now, where were we? Oh, right. The moment that would change everything. After the disaster in Africa, both Rome and Carthage realized they were locked in a struggle that would test the very foundations of their civilizations. Neither side could afford to lose, but neither side had found a way to win decisively. The war shifted back to its original theater, Sicily. But now it had become something much more brutal and systematic than the early campaigns. Romans adapted their strategy based on hard-earned lessons. Instead of seeking quick victories, they focused on what they did best: patient, methodical conquest. City by city, fortress by fortress, they tightened their grip on eastern Sicily. Meanwhile, Carthaginians fell back on their traditional strengths, using naval superiority to maintain key strongholds while launching surprise attacks wherever Roman defenses looked weak. The result was a grinding war of attrition that would drag on for over a decade. Here's what made this phase of the war so incredibly brutal. Both sides were fighting with the accumulated experience of years of conflict. There were no more easy victories based on tactical surprises. Every battle was between veterans who knew exactly what their enemies were capable of. Roman siege warfare became terrifyingly efficient. When Romans surrounded a city, they built not just walls around it, but entire fortified camps with workshops, granaries, and permanent defenses. They could maintain a siege indefinitely while the people inside slowly starved. Carthaginian hit-and-run tactics became equally sophisticated. Using their naval mobility, they could land forces at unexpected points, strike at Roman supply lines, and disappear before Roman armies could respond. But siege warfare in the ancient world wasn't just about military tactics. It was about human endurance. Can you imagine what it was like to be trapped inside a besieged city? Food running out week by week. Disease spreading through overcrowded conditions. The constant fear that today might be the day the walls finally fall. The siege of Lilybaeum became the perfect example of just how brutal this war had become. This Carthaginian stronghold on the western tip of Sicily was almost impregnable. Surrounded by water on three sides with massive fortifications protecting the land approach, Romans spent years trying to capture Lilybaeum. They built siege works that were engineering marvels, towers tall enough to overlook the city walls, catapults that could hurl massive stones over extraordinary distances, tunnels designed to collapse sections of the fortifications. But Carthaginians weren't just sitting there waiting to be conquered. They launched constant sorties to destroy Roman siege equipment. They used ships to bring in supplies and reinforcements. Most ingeniously, they used divers to sabotage Roman efforts to block the harbor. Think about that for a moment. Carthaginian divers swimming underwater to destroy Roman naval barriers. This wasn't just warfare. This was engineering combat at the highest level. The siege dragged on for nearly 10 years. 10 years. Entire generations of soldiers grew up during the siege of Lilybaeum. Roman soldiers who started the siege as teenagers finished it as middle-aged men. Meanwhile, naval warfare continued to escalate in scope and brutality. Romans kept building fleets and learning hard lessons about Mediterranean seamanship. Every storm taught them something new about naval architecture. Every defeat showed them weaknesses in their tactics. Gradually, painfully, Romans were becoming a genuine naval power. But the sea is a harsh teacher, and Romans paid a heavy price for their education. In 255 BC, a Roman fleet carrying survivors from the African disaster was caught in a storm off the southern coast of Sicily. Over 200 ships were lost in a single day. Tens of thousands of Romans drowned without ever facing an enemy. Any rational people would have concluded that the gods were against naval warfare. Romans built another fleet. In 249 BC, Consul Publius Claudius Pulcher led a Roman fleet in a disastrous attack against the Carthaginian naval base at Drepana. Warned by auguries that the gods were unfavorable, Claudius reportedly threw the sacred chickens overboard, declaring, "If they won't eat, let them drink." The result was exactly what you might expect from ignoring divine warnings. Carthaginian ships trapped the Roman fleet in the harbor and destroyed nearly every vessel. Claudius barely escaped with his life. But here's what's absolutely incredible about Roman psychology. These disasters didn't break Roman morale. They strengthened Roman determination. Every Roman naval defeat was followed by systematic analysis of what went wrong and how to do better next time. Romans started recruiting experienced sailors from Greek cities. They improved ship design based on captured Carthaginian vessels. They developed new tactics specifically adapted to Mediterranean conditions. Most importantly, Romans never let naval disasters prevent them from continuing land operations, while Roman fleets were learning to master the Mediterranean through trial and error. Roman armies continued their patient conquest of Sicily. The combination of superior siegecraft and inexhaustible manpower gradually wore down Carthaginian resistance. By 241 BC, Carthage held only two major strongholds in Sicily, Lilybaeum and Drepana. But these weren't just military positions, they were symbols of Carthaginian determination to continue the fight. Here's where the war reached its most crucial phase. Both sides were approaching exhaustion. Rome had been fighting continuously for over 20 years. They had lost hundreds of thousands of men and built multiple fleets from scratch. The Roman treasury was nearly empty. Carthage was in even worse shape. Years of hiring mercenaries had drained their finances. Their traditional trade routes were disrupted by constant warfare, most dangerously. Carthaginian citizens were beginning to question whether Sicily was worth this enormous cost. Something had to give. The final phase of the war would be decided by one last naval campaign. But this time, with a crucial difference. Romans had finally learned how to fight at sea. The new Roman fleet was built using the latest techniques learned from decades of experience. Roman sailors were now veterans who understood Mediterranean weather patterns and enemy tactics. Most importantly, Rome had developed a naval strategy that played to their strengths rather than simply copying Carthaginian methods. Instead of trying to match Carthaginian seamanship, Romans focused on using their fleet to support land operations. Roman naval tactics were designed to transport armies safely, supply besieged cities, and prevent enemy reinforcement. Exactly the kinds of operations that could win wars. The decisive moment came in March 241 BC, when a Roman fleet under Gaius Lutatius Catulus intercepted a Carthaginian supply convoy heading for Sicily. This is it, the moment we've been building to. The Carthaginian fleet was heavily loaded with supplies for their remaining garrisons. Their ships were slower than usual and couldn't maneuver as effectively. The Roman fleet was operating close to their own bases with ships specifically designed for Mediterranean combat. When the two fleets met off the Aegates Islands, Romans had every advantage. Experience, preparation, tactical position, and motivation. After 23 years of war, this Roman fleet represented everything Rome had learned about naval combat. The battle was swift and decisive. Carthaginian resistance collapsed under coordinated Roman attacks. Over 100 Carthaginian ships were captured or sunk. The supply convoy was completely destroyed. With this victory, Rome had finally achieved what they had been fighting for since 264 BC. Complete control of the waters around Sicily. Carthaginian commanders looked at their strategic position and reached an inescapable conclusion. Without naval superiority, they couldn't supply their remaining garrisons in Sicily. Without supplies, those garrisons would fall. Without Sicily, Carthage had lost the war. For the first time in over 2 decades, Carthage was ready to accept Roman peace terms. But after 23 years of brutal warfare, what kind of peace would Rome demand? Caesar is making the decision that will... Wait, no. Let me correct that. This is Hamilcar Barca standing on the walls of Lilybaeum, watching Roman ships control waters that had been Carthaginian for centuries. This is it. the moment that would determine the future of the Mediterranean world. The Carthaginian general surveyed the strategic situation with the clear eyes of a professional soldier. His remaining forces in Sicily were cut off from supplies and reinforcement. Roman armies were closing in on the last Carthaginian strongholds. Most importantly, Carthage no longer had the resources to continue fighting. But Hamilcar Barca wasn't just any Carthaginian general. This was the man who had spent years learning to fight Romans on their own terms. He had studied Roman tactics, Roman psychology, and Roman weaknesses. If anyone could find a way to continue the war, it would be Hamilcar. Here's what made this moment so extraordinary. Hamilcar knew he could probably hold Lilybaeum for months, maybe even years. Roman siege warfare was methodical but slow. With enough determination, Carthaginian forces could make Romans pay a heavy price for every victory. But Hamilcar also understood something that would define Carthaginian strategy for the next generation. This war wasn't really about Sicily anymore. It was about whether Carthage would survive as an independent power or become just another Roman subject state. The decision Hamilcar faced was brutal in its simplicity. Accept defeat now and preserve Carthage's remaining strength, or fight to the bitter end and risk everything. Meanwhile, in Carthage itself, the political situation was reaching a crisis point. 23 years of continuous warfare had drained the treasury and exhausted the population. Carthaginian merchants, who had built their civilization on profitable trade, were beginning to calculate the cost of continued resistance. Here's what's crucial to understand about Carthaginian decision-making. Unlike Rome, where military glory was seen as the highest virtue, Carthage was fundamentally a business civilization. Carthaginian leaders were used to making hard-headed calculations about costs and benefits. The calculation in 241 BC was stark. Continuing the war might preserve Carthaginian honor, but it would certainly destroy Carthaginian prosperity. When Roman terms arrived, they were harsh, but not completely devastating. Rome demanded that Carthage evacuate Sicily entirely and pay a massive indemnity over 10 years. Carthaginian prisoners of war would be returned, but Carthage would have to acknowledge Roman supremacy in the Western Mediterranean. The Carthaginian Senate faced the most important decision in their city's history. Accept these terms and survive as a diminished but independent state, or reject them and face the possibility of complete destruction. The debate in Carthage must have been incredibly intense. Imagine the arguments on both sides. The war party, led by veterans like Hamilcar, argued that accepting Roman terms would be the end of everything Carthage had built over centuries. Give up Sicily today and Romans will demand Spain tomorrow. Accept tribute now and we'll be paying Roman taxes for generations. The peace party, dominated by merchants and traders, made equally compelling arguments. We've lost hundreds of ships and thousands of men. Our trade routes are disrupted. Our allies are abandoning us. How much more can we sacrifice for the sake of pride? What tipped the balance was a hard economic reality. Carthage simply couldn't afford to continue the war. The First Punic War had cost Carthage an estimated 500 talents of silver annually, an enormous sum that represented a significant portion of their entire national income. The indemnity demanded by Rome was 3,200 talents, spread over 10 years. It was a crushing burden, but it was actually less than Carthage had been spending annually to fight the war. From a purely financial perspective, peace was cheaper than war. But the psychological impact of this decision would reverberate for generations. When Hamilcar Barca received orders from Carthage to negotiate surrender, he obeyed. But he never forgot the humiliation. Years later, he would make his young son Hannibal swear an oath of eternal hatred against Rome. The First Punic War was ending, but the seeds of the Second Punic War were already being planted. The formal surrender negotiations took place on Roman terms and Roman territory. Carthaginian ambassadors were required to come to the Roman commander and acknowledge defeat publicly. Here's what made this moment so significant for Roman psychology. For the first time in their history, Romans had defeated a major Mediterranean power in a prolonged war. They had proven that Roman persistence could overcome any enemy advantage. Naval supremacy, superior resources, even geographical advantages. The peace treaty was signed in March 241 BC, officially ending the First Punic War after 23 years of conflict. But the most important consequences of this war weren't written in any treaty. They were written in the transformed character of both civilizations. Rome emerged from the war as a Mediterranean power for the first time. Roman fleets now patrolled waters that had been controlled by others for centuries. Roman armies had proven they could fight successfully far from Italian soil. Most importantly, Romans had developed the confidence that they could defeat any enemy if they were willing to pay the price. The war had cost Rome enormously. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, multiple destroyed fleets, a treasury drained by decades of military spending. But Romans looked at these costs as investments in future security. They had bought their way into the ranks of great Mediterranean powers. Carthage, meanwhile, had learned a bitter lesson about Roman determination. Carthaginian leaders had expected Romans to give up when the costs became too high. Instead, they had discovered that Romans would pay any price to achieve their objectives. This realization would fundamentally reshape Carthaginian strategy. If Romans were willing to fight wars of unlimited duration for limited objectives, then any future conflict would need to be decided quickly through decisive victories. The stage was being set for Hannibal's later campaigns. Brilliant, audacious strikes designed to force Roman surrender before Roman persistence could wear down Carthaginian resources. But that's getting ahead of our story. The immediate aftermath of the First Punic War created problems that neither side had anticipated. In silence that followed, both civilizations began to grapple with what they had accomplished and what it would mean for the future. In the silence that followed the signing of the peace treaty, something extraordinary began to happen. The ancient Mediterranean world started to reorganize itself around a new reality. Rome wasn't just another Italian city-state anymore. They were now a major power with territories beyond Italy and fleets capable of projecting force across the Mediterranean. But with great power came great complications that Romans hadn't fully anticipated. What Rome couldn't have known was that winning their first overseas war would create a whole new set of challenges that would fundamentally transform their republic. Sicily became Rome's first provincia, literally a sphere of command for a Roman magistrate. But how do you govern a large island full of Greek cities, Carthaginian settlements, and native Sicilian communities that had been fighting each other for generations? Roman solutions were typically practical. They divided Sicily into administrative districts, appointed Roman governors with broad authority, and established a system of taxation that would fund the Roman military presence. It was efficient, but it was also the beginning of something that would eventually transform Rome from a republic into an empire. Here's what's absolutely crucial to understand about this moment. Romans had always governed through partnerships and alliances. Italian cities that joined Rome kept their own laws and customs while contributing soldiers to Roman armies. But Sicily was different. Sicily was conquered territory inhabited by people who had never asked to be Roman. The precedent being set would echo through centuries of Roman history. Meanwhile, Carthage was dealing with consequences that were even more immediate and devastating. The mercenary armies that had fought for Carthage and Sicily were now returning home, expecting to be paid for over 2 decades of service. Here's where Carthaginian reliance on hired soldiers created a crisis that Roman citizen armies would never have faced. When Roman soldiers returned from war, they went back to their farms and families. When Carthaginian mercenaries finished a campaign, they expected cash payments that would set them up for life. The problem was, Carthage was broke. 23 years of war followed by a massive Roman indemnity had drained the Carthaginian treasury. When thousands of mercenaries arrived in North Africa demanding their back pay, Carthaginian officials did what broke governments throughout history have done. They stalled. "Wait a few months," Carthaginian administrators told the mercenaries. "We're liquidating assets. We'll have your money soon." But mercenaries aren't known for their patience, especially when they're thousands of miles from home with no other source of income. What happened next was a nightmare that would haunt Carthaginian strategic thinking for generations. The unpaid mercenaries rebelled and began conquering Carthaginian territory in North Africa. This wasn't just a mutiny. It was a full-scale war that threatened to destroy Carthage more completely than Rome ever had. Imagine the irony. Carthage had survived 23 years of Roman attacks only to face destruction from their own hired soldiers. The rebellion was led by a Libyan named Matho and a Gallic mercenary commander named Spendius. These weren't primitive barbarians. They were experienced military professionals who understood siege warfare, naval operations, and political strategy. Worse, they were fighting on Carthaginian territory against Carthaginian civilians. The mercenaries knew exactly where Carthaginian wealth was stored, which cities could be held, and which routes could be cut to isolate Carthage itself. The situation became so desperate that Carthaginian citizens who had lived comfortable civilian lives were forced to take up arms to defend their own city. Women and children helped build fortifications. Elderly merchants who hadn't held weapons since their youth found themselves manning the walls. And here's where the aftermath of the Roman War created a strategic disaster. Carthage had just lost most of their experienced military leadership in Sicily. Hamilcar Barca and other veterans were available, but many of the officers who knew how to fight land campaigns were dead or captured. The man who saved Carthage was the same Hamilcar Barca, who had surrendered to Rome. Through a combination of brilliant tactics and ruthless determination, Hamilcar crushed the mercenary rebellion in a series of campaigns that were even more brutal than the Roman War had been. But the cost of this victory was enormous. Carthage had been forced to fight a second major war immediately after losing the first. Their resources were completely exhausted. Their territory in North Africa was devastated. Most importantly, their confidence in mercenary armies was permanently shaken. Hamilcar's solution was revolutionary. Instead of relying on hired soldiers from across the Mediterranean, Carthage would build a new kind of army based on Spanish recruitment and training. Young men from Carthaginian territories in Spain would be trained from childhood in Carthaginian methods and loyalty. This decision would have consequences that reached far beyond anything Hamilcar could have imagined. The Spanish-trained army he created would eventually be commanded by his son Hannibal in the Second Punic War. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. The immediate aftermath of the First Punic War created ripple effects that spread far beyond Rome and Carthage. Other Mediterranean powers watched the war's outcome with great interest and considerable alarm. If Rome could defeat Carthage, the greatest naval power in the Western Mediterranean, what did that mean for everyone else? Greek cities that had maintained independence for centuries began reconsidering their strategic positions. Gallic tribes in what is now France and northern Italy started preparing for the possibility of Roman expansion. Even distant kingdoms like Egypt and Syria began factoring Roman power into their diplomatic calculations. The balance of power that had existed for generations was permanently altered. For Rome, victory brought not just territorial gains, but a fundamental shift in national psychology. Romans had always seen themselves as the natural leaders of Italy, but now they began to think on a Mediterranean scale. Why stop at Sicily? What about Sardinia? What about Spain? What about the rich trade routes that connected all these territories? The First Punic War had taught Romans that they could compete with anyone if they were willing to pay the price. More dangerously, It had taught them that the price of victory was often less than the cost of defeat. Roman strategic thinking began to embrace what we might call preventive war. The idea that it's better to fight enemies when and where you choose rather than wait for them to threaten you directly. This mindset would drive Roman expansion for the next several centuries. Meanwhile, Carthaginian strategic thinking was moving in the opposite direction. They had learned that prolonged wars with Rome were unwinnable. If there was going to be a next time, it would have to be decided quickly through bold strokes that eliminated Roman advantages. Sound familiar? This was exactly the strategic thinking that would lead to Hannibal's famous march across the Alps. An audacious attempt to win a war against Rome before Roman persistence could wear down Carthaginian resources. Both sides were learning lessons from the First Punic War, but they were learning very different lessons. The most important consequence of all wasn't military or political, it was economic. The war had demonstrated that Mediterranean-wide conflicts required resources on a scale that no single city-state could sustain indefinitely. Future wars would be won by whoever could mobilize the largest population, the most extensive territory, and the most diversified economy. In this new reality, Rome had enormous advantages. Their system of alliances meant they could draw soldiers from across Italy. Their territory provided diverse resources and multiple sources of taxation. Most importantly, their political system was designed to make long-term commitments and stick to them regardless of short-term costs. Carthage, for all their commercial sophistication, was still fundamentally a single city controlling distant territories through hired armies and commercial arrangements. This system was enormously profitable in peacetime, but it was vulnerable to exactly the kind of prolonged warfare that Romans excelled at. The seeds of future conflicts were being planted in the very structure of post-war Mediterranean politics. But there was something else happening in the aftermath of this war. Something that would influence the development of Western civilization for centuries. Romans were beginning to see themselves as the inheritors of Mediterranean greatness. They had defeated the successors of the Phoenicians who had founded cities across the Mediterranean. They controlled Sicily, where Greeks had built some of their most magnificent colonies. They commanded seas that had been traveled by legendary heroes and mythical figures. This wasn't just political expansion. It was cultural expansion on an unprecedented scale. Roman writers began creating literature that placed Rome at the center of Mediterranean history. Roman artists started incorporating Greek and Carthaginian influences into distinctly Roman styles. Roman engineers began building infrastructure that connected Italian methods with techniques learned from conquered territories. The First Punic War hadn't just changed the balance of power, it had created the foundation for what would become Roman civilization. Looking back across the centuries, it's hard to imagine how different our world might have been if this war had ended differently. Picture an alternate timeline where Carthaginian naval supremacy had prevented Roman expansion beyond Italy. No Roman Empire, no roads connecting Britain to Mesopotamia, no Latin language spreading across Europe and forming the basis for Spanish, French, and Italian. No Roman law providing the foundation for legal systems across the Western world. The First Punic War wasn't just a conflict between two ancient city-states. It was the moment when the trajectory of Western civilization was determined. But here's what's absolutely fascinating when you really dive into the details. Neither side planned for the war to become what it became. Romans initially saw Sicily as a limited intervention to prevent Carthaginian domination of a strategic location. Carthaginians viewed Roman involvement as a temporary irritation that could be resolved through traditional diplomacy and limited warfare. Instead, both civilizations discovered something about themselves that would define their characters for centuries. Romans learned that they were capable of almost unlimited persistence when they believed their security was at stake. The ability to rebuild fleets after disasters, to continue sieges for years, to absorb enormous casualties without losing determination, these became defining characteristics of Roman power. Modern connections sound familiar. It should. The same kind of grinding, resource-intensive warfare that characterized the First Punic War would appear again and again throughout history. World War I's trench warfare, World War II's industrial mobilization, the Cold War's decades-long strategic competition. In each case, victory went to the side that could sustain the effort longest, not necessarily the side with the best initial advantages. But Carthaginians learned something equally important. They discovered that their commercial model of civilization, for all its sophistication and prosperity, was vulnerable to opponents who were willing to sacrifice everything for victory. This tension between commercial prosperity and military determination is still relevant today. How do wealthy, trade-based societies defend themselves against opponents who are willing to pay any price for their objectives? It's a question that modern democracies still struggle with. The strategic lessons of the First Punic War influenced military thinking for centuries. Roman emphasis on systematic preparation, methodical execution, and unlimited commitment became the model for later empires. British naval power during the Napoleonic Wars. American industrial mobilization during World War II. The patient, resource-intensive strategies that eventually wore down opponents who had initial tactical advantages. Carthaginian innovations in combined arms warfare, naval tactics, and rapid strategic strikes influenced everyone from Alexander's successors to Napoleon's campaigns. The idea that superior mobility and tactical brilliance could overcome resource disadvantages became a recurring theme in military history. But the most profound legacy of the First Punic War wasn't military. It was political and cultural. The war established the precedent that Mediterranean conflicts would be won by whoever could mobilize entire populations for extended periods. This insight would drive the development of Roman institutions that could sustain century-long expansion campaigns. Roman engineering, Roman law, Roman administration. All of these developed in response to the challenges of governing territories won through prolonged warfare. The Roman Republic's ability to integrate conquered populations, exploit diverse resources, and maintain military commitments across vast distances all grew out of lessons learned during the First Punic War. Here's what's truly remarkable about Roman adaptability. They entered the war as a land-based Italian power with virtually no naval experience. They ended it as masters of the Mediterranean with fleets that could challenge anyone. This transformation happened not through some brilliant strategic vision, but through systematic learning from mistakes and persistent improvement of capabilities. That pattern, identifying weaknesses, developing solutions, and persistently implementing improvements, became the foundation of Roman success for the next 5 centuries. Meanwhile, Carthaginian responses to their defeat shaped a different kind of legacy. Hamilcar Barca's reconstruction of Carthaginian power in Spain created the foundation for Hannibal's later campaigns. The emphasis on mobility, tactical brilliance, and decisive strikes that characterized the Second Punic War grew directly out of lessons learned from the First. But Carthaginian influence extended far beyond military tactics. Their commercial networks, engineering techniques, and administrative methods were absorbed by Rome and eventually spread across the Mediterranean. Many of the trade routes that connected the Roman Empire were originally established by Carthaginian merchants. In a very real sense, Roman civilization was built on Carthaginian foundations, even though Romans were the ultimate victors. The human cost of this war was staggering by ancient standards. Conservative estimates suggest that over 200,000 Romans died during the 23 years of conflict. Carthaginian casualties were probably similar. When you add in allied forces, mercenaries, and civilian casualties, the First Punic War may have cost 500,000 lives. But here's what made this conflict different from most ancient wars. The casualties weren't concentrated in a few major battles. Instead, they were spread across decades of siege warfare, naval disasters, and grinding campaigns that wore down entire generations. Imagine the psychological impact on both societies. families that lost fathers, sons, and brothers to a war that seemed to stretch on forever. Veterans returning from Sicily with memories of friends who died in battles whose names most people couldn't even pronounce. Children growing up in cities that had been at war for longer than they had been alive. Yet both civilizations found ways to sustain the effort for over 2 decades. This tells us something profound about human societies and their capacity for endurance when they believe fundamental values are at stake. The economic transformation was equally significant. Before the war, Rome was essentially a large Italian city-state, with an agricultural economy and limited international trade. By the war's end, Romans were collecting taxes from Sicily, maintaining fleets across the Mediterranean, and managing supply lines that stretched for hundreds of miles. This economic expansion required institutional innovations that would define Roman government for centuries. Provincial administration, military logistics, taxation systems, naval infrastructure. All of these developed in response to challenges created by the First Punic War. Carthage experienced the opposite transformation. From a Mediterranean-wide commercial empire, they were reduced to a regional power focused primarily on Spanish territories. But this concentration of resources would eventually enable the remarkable campaigns of the Second Punic War. Perhaps the most important legacy of all was the precedent established for Roman-Mediterranean relations. The First Punic War demonstrated that Rome would fight unlimited wars to prevent any single power from dominating regions that Romans considered strategically important. This principle would drive Roman expansion for the next several centuries. Every subsequent Mediterranean power, whether Greek kingdoms, Gallic confederations, or Germanic tribes, would have to consider the possibility that conflict with Rome might become a fight to the death, rather than a limited war for specific objectives. This knowledge fundamentally altered the psychology of international relations in the ancient world. Diplomacy became more important because war with Rome was so dangerous, but it also made conflicts more likely because other powers knew they might not get another chance if Roman power continued to grow. The cycle of preventive wars that would characterize the next 2 centuries of Roman expansion can be traced directly back to lessons learned during the First Punic War. But we shouldn't romanticize this legacy. The systematic warfare that enabled Roman expansion also normalized levels of violence and destruction that were unprecedented in ancient Mediterranean history. The combination of Roman persistence, improved siege techniques, and unlimited war aims created conflicts that were far more devastating than traditional ancient warfare. Entire populations could be enslaved or killed. Cities could be completely destroyed. Economic systems could be permanently disrupted. This is the darker side of the Roman legacy. The demonstration that civilized, law-abiding societies could wage wars of unprecedented brutality when they believed their survival was at stake. Modern parallels are uncomfortable but undeniable. The total war doctrines of the 20th century, the willingness to use unlimited resources against any perceived threat, the integration of civilian economies into military efforts, all of these can be traced back to precedents established during conflicts like the First Punic War. So I have to ask you, do you think Rome's incredible resilience was born of iron discipline or pure dumb luck? Think about it. They lost entire fleets to storms, saw armies annihilated in Africa, faced bankruptcy multiple times, yet somehow kept fighting until they won. Was this the result of superior institutions and national character, or were Romans simply fortunate that their enemies made crucial mistakes at critical moments? Which Roman leader do you believe left the strongest, most lasting legacy? We've focused on the First Punic War, but this conflict produced leaders whose influence extended far beyond their immediate military achievements. Hamilcar Barca's son Hannibal would nearly destroy Rome 20 years later. Roman commanders developed tactical and strategic innovations that would be used for centuries. The institutional frameworks created during this war shaped Roman government long after the Republic became an empire. What lesson from this ancient conflict feels most urgently relevant to our world today? The tension between commercial prosperity and military determination. The challenge of sustaining public support for prolonged conflicts. The way that limited interventions can escalate into unlimited wars. The importance of institutional adaptability when facing unprecedented challenges. Looking back across more than 2 millennia, the First Punic War offers insights that remain disturbingly relevant. How do societies maintain their values while fighting existential conflicts? What price are civilized people willing to pay to preserve their way of life? When does necessary persistence become destructive obsession? These are questions that every generation must answer for itself. The Romans and Carthaginians who fought this war couldn't have imagined that their decisions would still matter thousands of years later. But they established precedents and created institutions that continue to influence how we think about power, conflict, and the price of security. The Mediterranean world that emerged from the First Punic War was fundamentally different from the one that existed before it. More connected, more violent, more systematic in its approach to warfare and governance. It was the world that would produce Caesar and Augustus, Cicero and Virgil. The legal codes and engineering marvels that still influence our lives today. In the end, the First Punic War wasn't just about Sicily or naval supremacy or even the rivalry between Rome and Carthage. It was about what happens when civilizations discover that they're willing to sacrifice everything to avoid losing everything. And that, well, that's a discovery that changes the world forever. The echoes of those 23 years of conflict can still be heard today. In the legal systems that trace back to Roman law, in the engineering principles that connect back to Roman infrastructure, in the strategic thinking that links modern military doctrine to ancient precedents, but perhaps most importantly, in the understanding that some conflicts once begun take on a logic of their own that transcends the original causes and reshapes everyone involved. The First Punic War ended in 241 BC, but in many ways we're still living in the world it created.